Dim. Imagine waking up on a July morning and stepping outside to find the sky the color of a dying ember. Not at sunset, at noon. The air carries the faint, bitter taste of ash, and a fine gray dust has settled overnight on cars, on porches, on everything, even though the nearest flame is hundreds of kilometers away. That is what parts of Ontario experienced in the summer of 2026. And for millions of people, it was the first moment they understood that something had gone very, very wrong. By July 2026, according to Canadian authorities and widespread public reporting, a single wildfire burning in northern Ontario had surpassed 350,000 hectares. To put that number in perspective, 350,000 hectares is larger than the entire country of Luxembourg. It is an area so vast that, from space, the smoke plume appeared as a permanent feature on satellite imagery, drifting east and south across a continent. At the same time, British Columbia, on the other side of the country, was fighting its own simultaneous crisis. Two of Canada's largest provinces, burning at once. Canada has one of the most sophisticated wildfire response systems on the planet. So how did this happen? How did the fires grow faster than the response could follow? And were the warning signs there all along, quietly ignored? This documentary does not cover the breaking news. The news alerts have already done that. What this goes after are the deeper answers, the climate forces, the system limits, and the uncomfortable questions about what comes next. Because 2026 is not just a bad fire season, it may be a turning point. To understand why 2026 hit Canada the way it did, you first have to understand something that often gets lost in the headlines. This land was built to burn. The boreal forest, that vast ancient belt of spruce, pine, and fir that sweeps across the top of the continent, covering enormous stretches of Ontario, British Columbia, and beyond, is one of the largest fire-adapted ecosystems on the entire planet. Fire is not an interruption to this forest's story. Fire is part of the story. It has been for thousands of years. The trees evolved alongside it. Some species actually need fire to reproduce. The forest has always burned, recovered, and burned again in a cycle older than any human record. But knowing that fire belongs here does not mean every fire season is equal, and Canada's modern history makes that very clear. Most people who remember 2016 remember Fort McMurray. That fire in Alberta became one of the most widely documented natural disasters in Canadian history, a blaze that forced the mass evacuation of an entire city and burned through an enormous area of boreal forest. It was a landmark event, a before and after moment, and for years afterward, it stood as the reference point for what a catastrophic Canadian wildfire looked like. British Columbia, meanwhile, had already been writing its own difficult chapters. The 2017 and 2018 fire seasons in BC were among the most severe the province had recorded, burning millions of hectares and displacing tens of thousands of residents. For BC, severe fire seasons had become, if not routine, then at least a recurring reality. The province had begun to build its emergency planning around. Ontario was different. Historically, the province had seen significant wildfire activity in its vast northern reaches, but catastrophic events of the scale witnessed in 2026 were far less common. That distinction matters because it shaped both public expectations and the institutional muscle memory of the province's emergency response. Fire scientists often describe the conditions that allow fires to escape control in terms of three converging factors: drought, heat, and wind. Drought dries the fuel, the dead wood, the fallen leaves, the undergrowth, until it is almost eager to ignite. Heat pushes fire behavior to extremes, making flames taller, faster, and harder to predict. Wind carries embers far ahead of the main fire front, starting new ignitions kilometers away before any crew can respond. When all three arrive together, the result is something that operates beyond the reach of conventional suppression. Canadian government agencies and researchers have documented a trend over recent decades. Wildfire seasons starting earlier in the year, burning larger total areas than historical averages would suggest. That trend was not a secret in 2026. The data existed, the reports had been written, which raises the question this documentary keeps circling back to. If the warning signs were there, what exactly happened when 2026 arrived? The answer begins with the conditions that built the crisis, one dry month at a time. Every catastrophic wildfire season has a backstory. It rarely begins with a spark. It begins months earlier, sometimes an entire year before the first flame, in the quiet accumulation of conditions most people never notice until it is far too late to matter. For Canada in 2026, that backstory started in winter. Across key regions of both Ontario and British Columbia, snowpack levels came in below what fire managers and hydrologists consider normal. Snow matters enormously to wildfire risk, not just because it insulates the ground, but because, as it melts through spring, it delivers moisture deep into the soil, into the root systems, into the layers of dead vegetation that blanket the forest floor. Less snow means less of that slow, soaking moisture, and when spring arrived in 2026, it arrived dry. Reports from the period described an unusually warm and precipitation-deficient spring across large parts of both provinces. The ground that should have been waterlogged and spongy heading into summer was instead dry and brittle far earlier in the year than typical, and that matters because of something fire scientists call fuel load. Think of fuel load this way. Every year, a forest sheds material, dead leaves, fallen branches, dried out undergrowth, standing dead trees that insects, previous fires have killed but left standing. In a healthy fire cycle, periodic smaller fires consume this material before it can accumulate to dangerous levels. But in areas where fire has been suppressed for decades or where drought has killed vegetation faster than it can decompose, material builds up year after year, like paper stacked in a room with no ventilation. When a fire finally arrives, it does not just burn, it explodes. The more fuel, the more heat generated, the faster the fire travels, and the harder it becomes for any suppression effort to slow it down. In Ontario, the geography added another layer of complexity. The province's vast northern boreal stretches are sparsely populated. A fire igniting in a remote area can burn for days, even a week or more, before it grows large enough or moves close enough to infrastructure to trigger the kind of emergency declaration that mobilizes maximum resources. By that point, under the right conditions, it is no longer a manageable fire. It is a landscape-scale event. British Columbia presents a different but equally dangerous picture. Its mountainous terrain channels wind in unpredictable ways, accelerating fires up steep slopes and funneling them into valleys where communities sit embedded within. Right at the edge of forested land, BC has faced severe fire seasons before. The province is no stranger to this. The combination of dry conditions and complex terrain in 2026 created what fire weather forecasters describe as extended fire weather windows. A fire weather window is exactly what it sounds like, a period when wind speed, low relative humidity, and high temperatures align simultaneously. During these windows, fires do not just grow, they run. Suppression crews describe it as trying to hold back something that has its own momentum, its own logic, indifferent to anything humans place in its path. Climate scientists and Canadian government agencies have consistently identified warming temperatures and shifting precipitation patterns as factors that increase both the frequency and the severity of these fire weather windows. To be precise about what that means, the scientific and governmental position is that a warming climate creates conditions more favorable to extreme fire behavior. Attributing any single season entirely to climate change requires formal attribution research that takes time to complete. The broader trend, as documented by researchers and agencies over many years, points in one direction. The conditions in 2026 were not a surprise to everyone watching. The warnings were there, written in the snowpack data, in the spring drought reports, in the fuel load assessments, and yet, when the fires finally came, the scale of what happened next still caught many people off guard. The question is why, and that is exactly where we are going next. By July 2026, the number had become impossible to ignore. Canadian authorities reported that a single wildfire burning in northern Ontario had surpassed 350,000 hectares. That figure appeared in headlines, scrolled across news tickers, and trended across social media. But for most people, it remained just a number. Abstract, distant, hard to feel, so let's make it real. 350,000 hectares is larger than the entire country of Luxembourg. It is larger than the state of Rhode Island. It is an area so vast that if you stood at one edge of it and drove at highway speed toward the other side, hours would pass before the burned landscape gave way to anything green. This was not a fire. This was a geography, and it was still growing. What made Ontario's fire so difficult to contain was not simply its size, it was its behavior. When a wildfire climbs out of the undergrowth and reaches the canopy, it becomes something else entirely. Fire scientists call it a crown fire, and the difference is not just visual. A crown fire moves faster, burns hotter, and generates its own weather systems, columns of superheated air that can throw burning embers, called firebrands, kilometers ahead of the main fire front. Those embers land in dry fuel and ignite new fires, called spot fires, that can appear without warning far beyond. Any containment line crews have spent days constructing. In conditions like those reported across Ontario in July 2026, suppression teams were not just fighting one fire, they were chasing dozens of new ignitions simultaneously, each one capable of becoming its own crisis. While Ontario burned, British Columbia was facing its own emergency. The two crises unfolded in parallel, separated by thousands of kilometers but connected by the same brutal arithmetic. Canada has a finite number of aerial tankers, a finite number of trained ground crews, and a finite amount of specialized equipment. When one province faces a major fire event, national resources flow toward it. When two provinces face major events at the same time, those resources have to be divided, and division means delay, and delay means growth. According to publicly reported accounts of the 2026 season, BC's fire activity placed significant additional strain on an already stretched national response system. The specific details of individual BC fires continued to develop as the season progressed, but the broad picture was consistent. Two of Canada's largest provinces were competing for the same pool of help at the same time. The human cost of all this was not confined to the fire lines. Across northern Ontario and parts of BC, communities received evacuation orders. Families packed what they could carry and left homes they did not know if they would return to. Emergency shelters filled, roads clogged, and hundreds of kilometers to the south, in cities that had never seen a flame, the sky turned gray. The air quality indices climbed into ranges that health authorities described as dangerous for vulnerable populations. The fires were invisible to millions of Canadians, and yet they were breathing them. There is another dimension to this story that deserves acknowledgement. Many of the lands most directly affected by Canada's 2026 wildfires are the traditional territories of Indigenous communities. These communities often sit at the front line of fire evacuations, and many carry generations of knowledge about fire's relationship with the land, knowledge that researchers and land managers have increasingly recognized as valuable, though the integration of that knowledge into formal fire management systems remains, by most accounts, an ongoing and incomplete process. The scale of what burned in the summer of the 2026 raises a question that no map or hectare count can fully answer. Behind every number was a system of people and machines and decisions, working under conditions most of us will never experience. So what were they actually up against? Here is something that rarely makes it into the headlines, but that every experienced wildfire manager understands deeply. At a certain scale, you do not fight a wildfire to put it out. You fight it to protect what is in its path, to slow it down, to buy time. Then you wait for the weather to do what no human force can. That is not a failure of will or technology. That is the physical reality of fire at its most extreme. The tools available to firefighting agencies are genuinely impressive. Aerial water bombers can drop thousands of liters in a single pass. Helicopter crews can reach terrain that no ground vehicle could access. Trained ground crews work in brutal conditions, cutting fire breaks, strips of cleared land designed to starve the fire of fuel before it arrives. Coordination centers track dozens of fires simultaneously, moving resources across vast distances in real time. On most days, in most fires, this system works. The majority of wildfires that ignite in Canada each year are caught small, suppressed quickly, and never make the news. But fire managers draw a critical distinction between what they call initial attack fires and extended attack fires. An initial attack fire is one that crews reach fast enough, in conditions manageable enough, to contain before it grows. An extended attack fire is one that escapes those early efforts, usually because the weather window is simply too extreme, the terrain too difficult, or the fire too fast-moving for any initial response to hold. Once a fire crosses into extended attack territory under the right conditions, the calculus changes entirely. The question is no longer how to stop it, it becomes how to manage it. In 2026, Canada did not face this challenge alone. Through long-standing formal agreements, Canada regularly exchanges firefighting personnel and equipment with the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other nations. These mutual aid networks are a genuine and important part of the global response capacity. But according to reporting on the 2026 season, that global pool of available resources was under strain. Other countries were managing their own fire crises simultaneously, and the competition for the same limited pool of aircraft, crews, equipment was a documented and reported pressure on the response. There is a deeper question that some fire ecologists and land managers have been raising for decades, and it is worth naming here carefully. A theory debated within fire science suggests that a century of aggressive fire suppression, the policy of extinguishing nearly every wildfire as quickly as possible, may have contributed to the very problem it was designed to prevent. The argument is that by removing fire from landscapes that evolved with it, suppression has allowed fuel loads to accumulate to levels produce far more intense fires when ignition finally does occur. This is not a settled conclusion. It is an active and contested debate among researchers and policymakers, and it carries significant implications for how land is managed going forward. Technology is entering this space too. Satellite detection systems can now identify new ignitions within minutes. AI-assisted modeling tools help predict where a fire is likely to spread under given weather conditions. Drone surveillance can put eyes on terrain that would otherwise take hours to reach. Experts who work with these systems are careful to note, however, that they assist decision-making. They do not replace the fundamental constraints of weather, terrain, and the hard limits of how many aircraft, crews a country can physically deploy at once. The people who fought the fires of 2026 were not failing. They were operating at the edge of what any system, however well designed, was built to handle. And that is precisely what makes the questions raised by this season so important. If fires of this scale cannot always be stopped, and if the conditions that create them are becoming more common, then the real question is not just about 2026, it is about what comes next. The fires of 2026 will eventually be contained. They always are. Rain comes, temperatures drop, the wind shifts, and the flames that seemed unstoppable find their limits. But the conditions that built this crisis, the dry winters, the early heat, the accumulated fuel, the stretched resources, those are not contained so easily. And that is the question this summer forces Canada and every fire-prone nation watching to sit with. What we have traced across this documentary is not simply the story of one catastrophic fire season. It is the story of a stress test. Ontario's fire surpassing 350,000 hectares, as reported by Canadian authorities in July 2026, was not an isolated anomaly. It arrived alongside a parallel crisis in British Columbia at a moment when national firefighting resources were already under pressure. The global pool of mutual aid was stretched thin. The scale, the simultaneity, and the speed of it all revealed the edges of systems that were designed for a different version of this landscape. As of the time this documentary was produced, The 2026 fire season remains active. Final burned area totals, full damage assessments, and the longer-term policy responses are still developing. Anyone who tells you with certainty what this season will ultimately cost, in hectares, in dollars, in lives disrupted, is telling you more than the available evidence currently supports. What experts and fire managers have said publicly, and what the evidence of recent decades suggests, is that the trajectory is not moving in a reassuring direction. Some argue that Canada's response systems are genuinely improving. Better technology, better coordination, better early detection. Others argue that the scale of adaptation required is not yet matched by the scale of action being taken. Both perspectives deserve to be heard. This is an open and consequential public debate, and 2026 has made it harder to defer. The forests of Canada have burned and regrown for thousands of years. Fire is not the enemy of this landscape. In many ways, it is part of its identity. The question 2026 forces us to ask is not whether fire will return. It will. The question is whether the communities, the ecosystems, and the systems we have built alongside these forests are ready for a fire future. Looks very different from the past we planned for. If this documentary raised questions you want to keep exploring, we will keep making them. Subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay with us, because this story is far from over.